In the last presentation, I talked about how political authority is connected to social hierarchies and inequalities. Another approach is the exploitative model. In this approach, we look at social hierarchies as being the result of economic exploitation. So here we need to introduce the figure of Karl Marx. Karl Marx is someone who brought this idea of economic exploitation to people's attention. He's the third major founder of the social sciences, along with Emil Durkheim and Max Weber. He's a German philosopher, economist, and social scientist, and also a political revolutionist. His two very famous works are the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. So in the Communist Manifesto, he lays out his ideas for economic revolution leading to communism, which he viewed as basically a utopia. Versus Das Kapital, he gives a strong critique of capitalism. So for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on Das Kapital. Marx is probably the most influential thinker of modern thought. He's best known for his view on human history. He's talking about two distinct categories of people who have been defined by their roles in production when he thinks about history. So the first category is the bourgeois. These are the people who own the factories, the tools of production, and the lands. So these are managers, bosses, and business owners. The other group of people is the proletariat, and these are the people who actually make the things in the society. They use the tools that the bourgeois own on a daily basis. So you could think of these as the laborers. Marx was, of course, thinking about the factory situation when he was conceiving of these ideas. His view of history really relies on what's called historical materialism. So this is, as it says on your slide, a view of history that views changes in economic production as the fundamental driving force of history. So everything we can see in history can be explained in terms of economic production. Compared to Weber, this is a very simple idea. Weber was considering multiple different systems and looking at their interactions, looking at many different domains of social life. He wasn't locked into the Western view of progress, and Marx, as we'll see, is really into the Western view of progress. But there's two key concepts to understand that are part of historical materialism. The first is the means of production. So these are the materials that people need to produce things. For example, land, machines, people as manual labor. And the second is relations of production. These are the sets of social roles associated with a stage of production. And each of the social roles defines the structure of the society based on their role in the processes of production. So if you think of feudalism, there are a great amount of land, and you have lords who own the land, and then you have peasants who work the land, and you have serfs who are owned by the lords. They were slaves. But then you also have craftspeople, those who produce the tools needed for the means of production. So in feudalism, the lords are the bourgeois, they're the owners of the land, and then you have the peasants who work the land, and the serfs who are owned by the land. So these are the proletariat. But then you also have craftspeople, and so these are an emerging middle-class group of people who are able to actually produce the tools needed for the means of production. So in capitalism, you have both a shift in the means of production. For example, farms becoming mechanized and industrialized, you don't need as much manual labor. Same with factories. You have assembly lines and so on. You don't need as many people. And so in the Marx view, when you have a shift of production, the means of production, the relations of production also then have to change, but they don't change on their own. There has to be a revolution for them to change. So we can look at this as when we look at the shift between the feudal system to the capitalist system, that there has to be that there's this close tie of the means of production to the relations of production, the social categories produced by these different means of production. So each transition from one system to another system is actually marked by a revolution. The idea of progress is really built in here. It's always getting better. It leads from something like feudalism to something like capitalism to something like communism. And communism is what we're working towards, and that will be the best system. So the relations, again, to recap, never actually change. It's the means of production that change as new tools emerge. And then the relations are unable to keep up with the demands of the new reality. So they're restrained by these new changes in production. So the only way then that the relations of production can change is through a revolution. In feudalism, you have this emergence of the middle class, the craftspeople, and they caused revolution, shifts towards the parliamentary system. All over Europe, you saw this happen, for example, in France. And so we could see this revolutionary shift occurring. To understand more of Marx's ideas, we have to understand his view of human nature, and it's good to take a moment here to compare our three major figures of the social sciences and how they each viewed human nature. So Durkheim viewed people as by their very nature selfish and greedy. Durkheim we talked about earlier in the quarter because he had important views on religion for us to consider. He saw people as so selfish that the only way we could actually see beyond our own needs and desires is through our social relationships, and that enables us to actually work together. Weber saw human nature as basically driven by a need to order. The world is naturally chaotic, and so we're driven constantly to continue to order it. This is why his idea of rationalization is so key. He thought of this as central to human nature. Marx takes a different view. From his writing, what human nature is all about is our desire to make things. So humans are makers, and production makes us feel fulfilled. One of the main problems then, in Marx's view, is that capitalism leads to alienation. This is a condition of really being separated from one's fundamental human nature, and of course, human nature for him involves making things, producing. In capitalism, we can't really do what we want to. There's all these different restrictions on what we can do and what we can make. So he says that alienation is an increasing problem with capitalism. And he lays out these 4 different ways people are alienated or within capitalist system. So the first thing is that people are alienated from the products. We aren't really making what we want to. So for example, a filmmaker makes commercials instead of movies in order to support oneself. And we're also alienated from the products in another sense. Each person in an assembly line has only one specialized job, and that's all they ever do. Instead of being invested in producing something, there's just one aspect of it that we end up focusing on in this new system. And we're also alienated from our own labor. So the technology that one uses defines what you do for the job. Instead of being able to work how you would like to, you're locked in to working in the way that the technology allows you. You're really bound by the tools of your labor. A third way that people are alienated in the capitalist system, according to Marx, is that workers are alienated from each other. So when you have such specialized knowledge, for example, on a factory line, then it makes you stop bonding with other workers around you. People are also alienated from our employers because of the political imbalances that are embedded in that context. Fourth view of alienation from Marx is that we're alienated from ourselves. So work is our essence as human beings, and we can't freely produce in the capitalist system, so this causes a fundamental alienation of ourselves. Offering a critique, and he's showing how deep. So the question still remains, why do workers continue to work under conditions that exploit them? Why do we put up with this? There's a few different ways that we'll think about this by way of trying to answer it. First is that there is political repression. There's repression that occurs through legitimated structures. These are policies that are legitimated through usually a legal system of some kind that are actually repressive. So a classic example, of course, are pre-civil rights era in the United States, Jim Crow laws. These were laws that actually legalized racism, reaffirming inequality through political means, and infringing on people's personal and individual rights. There's another aspect of repression, which is social repression, and this occurs through patterns of exclusion and prejudice that are not formalized. In other words, they happen in our everyday lives instead of being part of our legal system. An example is the ongoing issue of racism in housing in the United States. Housing agents encourage African American families and other families of color into certain neighborhoods for housing. This isn't something that is explicitly laid out as discrimination, but happens on a much more subtle level. So we could consider both of these when we're asking ourselves, why do people continue to work under conditions that exploit them? Marx gives us a few more concepts to consider as well. First is the asymmetry of labor negotiations. Workers are always at a disadvantage. In a capitalist system, you want to keep all expenses, including pay, as low as possible, so the actual value of the work is not reflected in wages. The goal is to continually cut costs and increase profit. People also don't get paid fair wages because workers are competing against each other for work, and at the end of the day, it's better to have some job than no job. So the system in many ways is based on supply and demand. When you have a shortage of labor, things can improve in terms of these negotiations for laborers. But when the market shrinks, as the recession we've just experienced, it's laborers who really bear the brunt. People all over the country are moving to Seattle because Seattle is one of the few places that has experienced this market shrinkage less than other places. So that means there's more jobs available. Overall, though, employers are in a situation where they have a lot of people to choose from, and they're able to offer lower wages as a result. And we have trends towards lower wages and less work in general, less people working full-time, and so on. So workers are at a disadvantage in negotiations, and unions try to offset this, but it's only ever partial in what they're able to do. And of course, we've seen dismantling of unions nationally as well. A second concept from Marx that helps us understand why we continue to participate in conditions that exploit us is commodity fetishism. And commodity fetishism involves misreading the value of commodities instead of seeing the actual costs of parts and labor. Instead, we're focused on prices, comparing prices of products to each other instead of the actual cost of production. And according to Marx, this is another form of alienation because we become alienated from the people who produce the items themselves. We could see this very clearly when we looked at the example of cell phone production. We could see how in cell phone production, people are, the average person who walks into the store to buy a cell phone does not have a clear concept of the conditions under which people in, say, factories in China who put the cell phones together actually live. We could clearly see how people who are laboring to put these phones together could never actually afford to buy a phone themselves, an Apple phone anyway, an iPhone. So we saw clear examples of that as well, and we could understand this as why people participate in conditions that exploit them is that there's a distraction, there's a focus on the value of commodities when we compare them to each other instead of looking beyond to see the costs and parts of labor and to relate to the laborers themselves who created the product or put the product together. Another question that gets presented is how did these inequalities be seen as natural to begin with? So there's a few different ways we can try to answer that question as well. In the Marxian explanation, changes of the means of production or the tools used to make things lead to new relations of production. And so you have new categories of people that then get defined. And what comes along with that shift is that people are defined in these new categories, and then there are new ideas of what makes a person important and who is worthy. So in the feudal system, if you are a peasant through your breeding, you might be understood to lack intelligence, but breeding is what determines your worth. According to Marx, when we have new social categories in capitalism, such as entrepreneur, labor, etc., what makes a person worthy is the level of self-reliance that they have. So self-reliance becomes what defines you as a human being in our society, and how hard you work, what you do by yourself, is really fundamental. If you're poor, it's because you're stupid, lazy, did not work hard, etc. The onus is all on you and you alone. Other factors aren't considered as an explanation of why you might be in a poor economic situation. Of course, we could see this really clearly in Gaywerts and Arrington's work following Papua New Guinea as it transitioned to this capitalistic system. Could see that people started to have these ideas, new ideas about people. Suddenly you have categories of people who are now labeled as poor and also associated with laziness and so on. So these values become so fundamental that they're understood as natural and they're seen as just the way things are. We have a hard time even imagining that things could be different, that these ideas about worthiness haven't always been this way and could be different. So that's one way that these inequalities come to be seen as natural. There's another term that's really important here, which is hegemony. So hegemony is the condition of believing in the naturalness of the conditions which are actually exploiting you. So, of course, this is just a more specific term that describes what I was just talking about. Antonio Gramsci brought this to our attention. He's a 20th century Italian political theorist and politician. And he said that this is actually the basis for political legitimacy as well, that hegemony only works this way, or political legitimacy only works because of hegemony. We can think of an example of something that we're familiar with. If you've ever flown on an airplane, you've gone through the metal detectors and so on at that the TSA is in charge of. You might have submitted to removing personal items, putting them through a conveyor belt to be viewed. Perhaps you've even been put into one of those X-ray type machines that read or take a picture of your body underneath your clothing and so on. Or you may have actually had a search of your body where someone actually patted you down and searched you. And most of us have submitted to this at some point in order to fly in an airplane. The general public thinks that this is just an essential part of what is necessary in order to fly safely. But if we really stop and think about it, there is probable cause to search someone that's built into our Constitution. The Fourth Amendment states this, and there's long legal precedents to support what this means as well. And actually, cops would not be able to perform the kinds of searches performed by the TSA legally. So there's something going on where we walk in to an airport, we submit to this other type of authority that we normally wouldn't submit to because we believe, or generally people believe, that this is what's necessary in order to fly on a plane safely. We take it for granted, and this is just something you do when you go to the airport. So that's hegemony right there, when it becomes something that you just do, but it's actually something that exploits you. There's an example of this that demonstrates this really well, where Kenneth and Mamie Clark did this study called the doll test. And they had children look at two different dolls, and then they asked the children, which one is pretty, which one is smart, which one is nicer, etc. And the children over and over again, African American children, chose the white doll, right? They saw it as the prettier, smarter, nicer doll over and over again. And I'm just looking now to see when they actually did this study. Okay, so yeah, they published these studies in 1939 and 1940. And these studies were really important to talk about internalized racism. But we can also see it as hegemony because these kids were looking at these dolls and looking at it as like, this is just the way things are. White babies are just smarter. That's just how it is. And this is obviously a condition of inequality along racial lines that's then being reinforced and maintained in our society. We could see this hegemonic system resulting from Jim Crow laws. And again, these ideas of inferiority from a very young age that establish and maintain systems of inequality. Now, studies like this have been done more currently, and I do believe that there have been shifts with children in terms of how they'll answer these questions with two different dolls. However, internalized racism is still an issue that people talk about very seriously, and it's an example of hegemony that is a very real part of everyday life. So this actually concludes the second presentation for Module 9.